Hey, welcome everyone. I'm Dave Rubenstein, Editor-in-Chief of SD Times, and today I'm joined by Chris Campbell and Juan Mazo of Veracode for a very important discussion about getting developers involved in efforts around application security. Chris is a Senior Principal Solutions Architect, and Juan is a Solutions Architect at security company Veracode. So before we get started, I have just a couple of quick announcements. First, because this is more of a panel discussion than a typical webinar slide presentation, we'll be taking questions throughout the talk, which you can submit at any time through your control panel. Secondly, we're recording the discussion, so it'll be available on demand starting tomorrow on the sdtimes.com website. Okay, so let's get into it. As we've been writing in SD Times, organizations today are putting more and more on development teams, testing, security, compliance, and of course, creating innovative applications. In the area of security, we've seen DevSecOps grow as a practice and businesses putting together development squads that include developers, testers, security experts, and even business side people. So let me start by asking you, Chris, why are organizations putting security onto development teams, and what are the benefits that they're looking to derive from that?
So I think, touching on what you talked about there, it's really about this idea that developing applications now is not just a case of saying, I'm going to write code and somebody else is going to deal with all the rest of the process. It's been well shown that the kind of throw it over the wall approach of here's some code, give it to the QA team to work on, and then give it to some sort of release team, and then give it to some sort of production maintenance team, doesn't provide any kind of efficiencies when it comes to operating applications. So DevOps is really about, this is one of the things I think that people tend to maybe misinterpret sometimes. DevOps is really about a cultural change. It's about providing application teams being set up in a way where they can operate an application throughout its entire life cycle. And security's, it's always been part of the application life cycle. There's really nothing new about that, but the ownership of it as something that sits within the development team is certainly something that's new. And I think, if security were to continue to sit outside the shift that's happening, like you said, there's a lot of people involved in this: business architects, UX people, QA people, release engineers, all forming essentially one virtual team. If security continued to sit outside of that, inevitably their voice would not be as well heard, within the application development process. So I think it's not a question of necessarily what benefits are there, although there obviously are. I think it's a question of it has to happen. This is not something that security teams can say, well, that's a flash in the pan. That's a development trend that will probably be around for a couple of years and then go away. It's a monumental shift in the way that people think about application development and deployment, and you either become part of it or you become irrelevant, really.
Mm-hmm. Great. Juan, you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think the best way to illustrate DevOps, or the concept of DevOps, the culture of DevOps, is honestly reading a really good book called The Phoenix Project, which if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. I know that the concept of DevOps to me was a little alien when I first started hearing about it, but then someone at Veracode introduced me to that book, and it really did set the stage for what is exactly. There you go. So you already have the second version of it. There you go. So it was a really good book. It did a great job of illustrating it. And really with DevOps, it's everyone has to kind of do something. They have to have the same goal in mind. They have to do their part to get that end deliverable. So exactly what Chris was saying, I got to agree with.
There you go.
That would be the one that I would follow on with. The Phoenix Project is a great book. It certainly tells the story really well about the scenario that everyone at some point has found themselves in, where you're writing an application and you're trying to make some new functionality improvement, and at the same time the house is burning down over in that distraction is constantly happening. That given that everyone now, and when I say everyone, I mean literally most businesses, it's very rare that I talk to an industry sector these days that doesn't have some sort of application development going on. So everyone's doing it. Not everyone necessarily has the same mature operating processes around applications. Not everyone's following ITIL to the absolute nth degree and is able to put all these systems and controls in place. So I think there's almost like a hidden benefit in the whole DevOps culture, in that it's not super difficult to follow, because it is ultimately, like I said, a cultural change. So you don't necessarily have to buy new technology to do it, even though there's stuff associated with it. But because it's almost something that is easy to understand, I think, not necessarily easy to implement, but easy to understand, any company can get the benefit from it. And what that ultimately means is that any company can kind of, insert these aspects of testing, security, automated release into their process, really regardless of how mature they are as a software development company. It's funny, we see very, very large banks who have more software developers than some of the largest software development organizations out there. And within those banks, you'll see teams that are super agile, putting out typically mobile releases and that more customer facing type activities. And then you'll see teams that are still stuck in the waterfall age. They still do either a monthly or a quarterly or sometimes a biannual release. And I don't think that, we'll probably touch on this later. I don't think that that's something that security teams necessarily take into account, that kind of broad spectrum. There is a tendency to maybe focus a little bit too much on it must be integrated, it must be super agile. That's probably one of I think the reality aspects that you need to bring into the whole process.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know that when we spoke earlier on a podcast, we were talking about making security tools more developer-centric. So, for instance, if a developer is, changing code in his pipeline, he will find out immediately if he's introduced a vulnerability or things like that. So, that certainly seems to be an evolution of tooling that didn't exist prior to DevOps and DevSecOps. Yeah, but so let me ask you this we'll get back to tools in a bit, but what I'm curious to know is, now we're putting security and governance and things like that on developers who aren't taught that in school or don't have the skills to know what to look for. So Juan, let me start with you on this. What kind of training are businesses providing to their developers to get them more skilled, to be able to identify security problems while they're coding?
I mean, the trading options that are available are, you start off with like self-service, right? What are people doing on their own to kind of get ahead of the game, ahead of the requirements? And you're going to find that more when the organizations are into security minded. But once they become security minded, they have various in-person trainings that they can get. They can go online and clearly hit up all the YouTube stuff they want in the world. But then there's more formal things that you can purchase from other companies, like e-learning courses. You also have things such as like what we have, security labs, where it's basically what's it called? A way to like, and Chris, please help me out with the words. It's an interactive way to like educate yourself on security. So if you're familiar with I believe offensive security, which is a certification where you can go out and actually hack a box and go through the process of hacking a box. We have something very similar where we have some labs that people can go in and kind of compete with their other team members to, find the bug, fix the bug, or hack the thing, whatever it may be, whatever the case may be. And through that process, you actually learn, right? Because there's just different ways that people learn. Some people can read a slide deck and like understand everything there. Some people can just listen, but then some other people need the experience hands-on to like actually type some code and have that feedback loop there to actually learn. So I think those are some of the best tools that are available out there right now. And again, if you're a developer and you're in an organization that's not security minded, go at it yourself. I think being resourceful is probably the best way to actually learn about application security and the things that you should be concerned about. Because ultimately, I think everyone wants to write good code. Everyone wants to kind of be like an artist of software development. And when it comes back to like, you wrote this code 10 years ago, and let's say you were a novice developer, you're going to know that it was not good quality stuff, right? But then when you start looking at the security stuff, that's when it's really scary, especially when you see it in the wild. So I think there's plenty of tools out there to actually help you fill those gaps. So if you're in an organization, again, that's not security minded, then take the initiative. But if you're lucky to be in one of those organizations that do care about it, then there's tools out there that can assist you with that.
Yeah, I think you make an interesting point about learning styles there. Sometimes I think it's easy to make an assumption that because developers are technical people, I mean, you know, define a developer. These days it can mean many different things. And people writing almost like no code, low code stuff through to, you know, people who are still writing in assembly. The idea that someone who, purely because they are technical, because they're a developer, has a distinct learning style is something that probably trips up quite a few organizations. So I would always spend a good amount of time kind of engaging with the people who are you know, who need the training and understanding what the breakdown is. It might be that you work in an organization where 95% of people like that interactive training, in which case great, that will satisfy that. It might be that there's more of a split. You know, I think I'll be right in saying that there's of the 3 or 4 different learning types, there's one that's kind of heavily the dominant one, and then there's, you know, a rough breakdown across the other 3. But you still need to cater for all of those learning types, and I think we all have different learning types depending on what it is that we're actually doing, what state of mind we're in, where we are. I know that I asked my team, the solution architect team at Veracode, a while back about their learning styles, and there was definitely a dominance, but you know, there were people who were vehemently against video content, absolutely hated it, because they thought, if I want to get to the info that I need, I have to skip through the video 20 minutes and then try and find the right slot. Give me the written content. And then there's people like me who have this idea that I like written content, but in reality, I can't stand it. I always documentation, and I'm looking for examples where I can copy and paste and fiddle with it myself. So I think you have to understand that aspect of the people that you're putting these educational tools out to. And you know, you talked about free stuff there as well. I wouldn't be afraid of things like YouTube. Obviously, some organizations might need to go through some, you know, proxy control issues there to get access to YouTube within their network, but you know, I wouldn't be afraid of that kind of free content. What you'll find is a lot of security professionals got the knowledge that they have from free content, from forums, from YouTube, from newsletters, from you know, the wide array of media formats that there are, where there are people trying to communicate about new cool stuff that they found.
You know what's one thing that's the most important, in my opinion, when it comes to learning anything, right? And you touched on it, is community. So if you're a lone developer and you're out there learning on your own, you have no one to like you know, speak and kind of figure out and exchange the ideas of what you guys are doing. If you have no community, you find yourself very lonely and not actually able to learn. So forums is massive, right? Like, I'm a big fan, honestly, of like Facebook groups. I'll go join the stuff that's useful for me. I see people having conversations, I engage in those conversations, and really the exchange of ideas, that's massive. And if you can find yourself the community, even if you've started within your own organization, between you and a friend, right? Using some of these interactive tools that are out there to just compete, to say, oh, how'd you figure that out so fast? Or what do you know? That's massive. I think collaboration, community, massive when you want to actually learn something.
And you never know, you might end up getting kind of an organically grown security champions program out of it.
Exactly.
So let me just circle back to a point that you made earlier, Juan, talking about security-minded organizations. Are there any organizations today that are out there that are not security-minded? I mean, it seems to me this is a massive problem that people have. We've been talking about it for years. if you're not security minded at this point, I don't even know what you're doing. So how do you make the differentiation there between?
You'd be surprised. So a lot of companies, especially smaller companies, smaller businesses, they're starting out, right? And especially if they're in like a regulated industry, they're looking to just hit the checkbox.
Mhm.
So that's a fact, right? So we have that issue. And then the reality is that if you don't have these huge requirements, regulators breathing down your neck, you're not really gonna spend money to fix security bugs unless you really, really, really care about your reputation. At the end of the day, it's always going to be, are we going to spend money on features? Or are we going to spend money on fixing bugs, right? And until they can start gathering metrics around what it's really costing them to fix these security bugs, right? If you can take it back to the factory days where, imperfections in the beginning of the manufacturing process would lead to rework down the line that costs money, right? If you can get that kind of mindset going and start thinking, all right, what can we do to kind of help curb that cost, right? And start measuring that cost across the SDLC, you're going to start seeing like, okay, maybe we do need to start taking a look at security. But reality is that, I would say there's more people interested in security than organizations interested in actually securing their applications, right? And it's a cost thing, it's a money thing.
Mm-hmm.
I'm reminded of I can say this because I know with absolute certainty that my father-in-law is not watching this webinar. I'm reminded with your question of many conversations that I've had with him. So he was managing director of a construction firm in the UK. He takes an interest in what I do, and every conversation that I've ever had with him has gone something along the lines of me saying, well, everyone needs to do this these days. It's not really optional. And him saying, yeah, but I run a construction firm, and who'd want to hack a construction firm? And now you look at the big boys, the Balfour Beatties and the like of the world, where their entire system is run on software, just the same as anybody else. They're not, just because they build buildings doesn't mean that they don't have applications that they're developing to give them some sort of edge over their competitors, especially in that really, really tight margin environment where 0.5% can mean the difference between making profit and making a loss on a job. So I think there are definitely still people out there who know that it's something that the wider world is talking about because they see it on the news, but don't necessarily join it up to their own businesses. Regulated industries, that kind of thing. Sure, they know what they need to do. They're told what they need to do, but there's a lot of people out there who know it but don't truly believe it, I think.
Yeah. I think a lot of that has to do also with smaller companies feel like they're not as risk. They're not a target for people who are looking to get identities or cash or ransomware and all this kind of stuff. So I think they feel like, well, if I'm flying below the radar, security is not as high a priority for me, as you said, as it would be for like a regulated industry or something like that.
Yeah.
So
definitely.
let me just go to a question now that we got from one of our attendees talking about training. And the question is, how do you train programmers on objective security criteria, if such things even exist? I face a lot of the same issues with performance engineering.
I mean, I can take a shot at that if you don't mind. So
Sure.
Objective criteria, right? There's the OWASP top 10. It doesn't get any more objective than a list of top 10 items that are known to be big security vulnerabilities across the web. So there's your objective list, right? Performance testing, I don't know anything about like standards that exist around that. So that's why it's almost a little bit different. And maybe I'm just answering it incorrectly when it comes to the performance side. But from the security side, there's the OWASP top 10. If you start educating your developers around that concept, that makes a lot more sense for your developers. Now, I think there was a couple parts to that question. Could you repeat that?
Yeah. So it was training programmers on objective security, which you addressed through OWASP. And then his name is Andre, says, I face a lot of the same issues with performance engineering. Those are the two parts of the question.
Gotcha. Yeah. So basically, with security, AppSec, the OWASP top 10, right? If you start educating your developers on that, that'll help them. And honestly, you can literally use a lot of free tools to get you like that entry level foot in the door of information around application security. And then you tell your developers, like, these are the top 10 items they find on the internet. It's no different than when people go out and like scan your networks, right? Your cybersecurity stuff. If your developers don't know, which is highly likely, right? They don't know how to fix these things. That's where these education tools come into play. And you know, there's just different tools out there that can give you all those remediation resources and make it very palatable for your developers to consume.
Yeah, this is interesting. Andre followed up to himself. He says, so we have 10 top 10 don'ts, but we don't necessarily have top 10 do's when it comes to performance. So
Interesting. So it's probably standards within the organization, right? That they've developed internally. But
right.
I think if you were to use something that's more portable across the industry, you can convince developers that they should care, because if you learn OWASP top 10 here, it adds value to your resume beyond your role today, right?
Right. Excellent. All right. So I wanted to get back to the tools conversation that we started a little earlier. So how have these tools evolved, security tools that security professionals would use now that are, you know, trickling down to the development teams? So how have they trained to address, you know, cold level vulnerabilities as they occur? And what was security like before these tools evolved, and how effective was that as opposed to what we're doing today?
Gotcha. Yeah. So what I see, the maturation process of security tools, right? In the past, there was like a security official who was hired to, you know, delegate the tools that they would use and manage the reports that they were going to make. And now those reports had like a dashboard. And in some cases, you know, you had MPT with like an Excel of things that was wrong with your stuff, right? And then you pass it to a developer looks at it and they're like, I don't know what to do with this stuff. Nowadays, you have something like automated scanning tools, which were put in the hands of security people first. And we have some good reports that can give you some information, but then developers are looking at this and saying, wait, you want this in my pipelines? That's going to slow down my pipelines. So then the developers take it on themselves, knowing that they have to do the security work, right? The security bug tickets. And now they have to integrate it into their pipelines, which is slowing down their releases.
Mhm.
So now sorry, did you have something to say there?
No, I was just nodding.
Sorry. So then you have pipelines that are slowing down, and developers are annoyed. So now they're taking all the tools in, and now they're using them they're pushing the tools to the limits of what they can do, right? And now we're at a point where we're saying, all right, how can we make these things faster? How can we integrate them? Do developers want to be in all these other screens, or do they just want to be like in their command line prompt looking at results there? Do they care about waiting 20 minutes, or do they want to wait 1 minute, right? So the maturation process is, the tools were here for a specific audience and specific requirements, but now the audience is shifting, and now the audience is making demands of the tools. So the tools that we have nowadays, especially like at our organization, they're just meant to be a little bit more nimble with these agile teams that exist within pockets of organizations or within organizations.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, when Veracode, certainly when I joined in late 2014 and definitely before that, we were still kind of in a world where a lot of the activity, shall we say, was being performed by the actual security teams. So, you know, the primary user of the service was often someone who was given an application as part of the release process and told, I need you to analyze this. You know, you go away and do all the analysis, Mr. Security Guy, and, you know, I expect back some sort of report, which for many people meant giving a PDF over, you know, giving a developer a 50-page PDF with all of the flaws that were found. That's just not tenable these days. You know, I honestly, thankfully, can't remember the last time a customer said to me, "So does your product produce PDFs?" You know, I'm quite happy now when really the only time that I ever say that is, "Hey, if you need to produce some evidence for audit time, here's how you make a PDF." It's just not something that developers have to work with these days, which is a big shift. And you're right, Han, it's the primary user has become the people who are writing the code. I think certainly Veracode as a vendor, and I think the industry in general has shifted probably engineering resource more than anything over the last sort of 3, 4, 5 years as DevOps has become more of a thing, to focus the efforts on improving scan times. You know, that's that's something that has really been a big blocker in the past to putting automated security testing into a pipeline. Is, you know, it's no good popping it in a pipeline if it takes 3 hours to complete. You know, we're now talking about scan times in seconds, and that's something that's much more amenable to people who are looking to get quick feedback, you know, release multiple times a day. I think there's another aspect to the maturity side of things as well, which isn't necessarily tool related, and I still see this in that there's still a lot of organizations out there for whom AppSec is penetration testing, yeah, or manual code review, and there's still a lot of maturity in that area around, okay, how can we move beyond a pen test every 6 weeks? I mean, that would be nirvana for a lot of organizations to do it that often, but how can we move beyond that to something that gives us a quicker turnaround time?
Interesting. So I was going to ask about the importance of automation in all of this, but since you addressed that so beautifully, I'll say, how close are we to autonomy, where these systems can actually just, you know, work on their own to identify security issues and remediate them with very little human intervention?
That is a really good question.
Are we even heading down that path? I mean, instead of asking, you know, are we close? Are we even going in that direction?
No, short answer, yes, absolutely. You know, the engineering and research teams at Veracode, and I suspect our competition as well, have definitely had conversations around things like auto remediation. There are definitely issue types that are more suited to that than others. I would be, I'd be surprised, though I'd be willing to eat my hat, but I would be surprised if we ever get to a point where you can do complete auto remediation. I think one of the things that people, I actually had this in my notes to talk about, you know, what does a security team need to do to make their developers effective at using a product? I think one of the things that people need to take into account with any security testing is that there's always going to be debate. You can't produce a completely 100% accurate set of scan results, where scan could mean anything. It could mean human review, it could mean automatic review, because there's, you know, there is a human element to understanding whether or not something is truly exploitable, and people are going to have different opinions. You know, the security guy whose job is to make everything as secure as possible is going to say that must be fixed. You know, the business guy whose job it is to make more money will say, well, I don't think that needs to be fixed. And then there's just general nuance about what's the right way to fix that thing. You know, so there's definitely movement in that direction, and it will help. It absolutely will help, because there is definitely a lot of kind of low-hanging fruit that we could just take out. You'd want to make sure that the efficiency rate is good, though. You know, it's almost no good saying that, hey, we can, you know, auto remediate these things if it's only 70% effective, and actually you still need to go through and double check everything. So it's a tricky conversation, I think.
Yeah, interesting, because people also talk about how, you know, the types of attacks are changing and the things that people need to guard against are constantly changing, which I guess would also kind of work against autonomy. But yet we see, when we look at the OWASP list, for instance, that the same vulnerabilities that they were writing about 20 years ago are still on the list. So is it just an inability to solve those problems, or a lack of interest on people to remediate those things, or a lack of understanding about how important they are? I mean, what's the gap there?
I mean, I look at it as the implementation is different for every single code, right? Code implementation is what drives these things. So generally, we speak at it at a high level, like, all right, this is the known code weakness for this, but how you actually fix it in your code is different from language to language perspective, right? So how you do it in Java is different to .NET, but then also within the context of your own source code that you're writing. So like, I'm an ex-IT manager, and like, I never believed in magic. So I always thought, like, all right, you need to go and do it the hard way. The hard way is probably going to be the right way to do it. Like in the past, there was profile migration, computer migration tools that can do it all for you. but one script could foul up the whole process, and now you got to do it manually anyways, right? There's certainly a lot of things happening within the tools that are enabling less and less involvement of the customer, right, or of the end user. So in previous reports, we tell you this is what's wrong, but nowadays we can tell you this is what's wrong, this is how you can fix it. And in future releases, I would imagine like, hey, we can recommend based on the way that you're writing code that this is probably the way you may want to implement it. But at the same time, if you have end users that are over time learning and becoming educated around how to code securely, then the need for that automation, automatically like fixing things is less and less, right? Because you have developers who know what they're doing. So it's almost like the ounce of cure versus the ounce of prevention. Which one is going to be more beneficial, right? And considering there's a cost associated with everything, and especially R&D costs for tools like that, you can imagine that people are going to probably invest in prevention versus the cure.
Mm-hmm.
I think.
All right. I just want to. I'm sorry. Were you going to add something, Chris?
I was just going to say, it's you've got to be realistic, I think, about the experience levels and the types of applications that are being created these days. Not everyone is a absolute Uber engineer that knows their code absolutely inside out and can tell you the absolute best optimized routine to use and all that kind of good stuff. There's a lot of people out there who have just picked up PHP and are writing PHP apps and are doing it really, really badly. And yet, because when they tender themselves out, they do it at a lower cost than everyone else, they win the deal, and they produce code for an organization that doesn't know any better, and boom, before you know it, you've got a web app that's absolutely full of holes. And it goes back to that original point you made, where I still don't really feel like security is as well taught in the kind of university type environment as it could be. It's definitely better. I mean, when I think back to doing a computer science degree in 2001, I had one 10-credit module out of 360 credits that I had to do over 3 years that even vaguely had anything about security in it. Realistically, you need to be treating security as part of how you learn to code, not this bolt-on thing. So when you're taught to code, you should be taught, here's how you code securely from the off as a default. But I don't think we're quite there yet, and we're probably always going to be saying, hey, people still create issues from 20 years ago. It's just that the issues will change as we move on in 20-year increments.
Right. So we're kind of coming up on our time. I just want to remind people, if they have a question, they can submit it now, and we'll get to as many as time will allow us now. But I just wanted to get back to one point that we didn't even touch on, which probably could be a whole webinar in and of itself, and that is the use of open source code in applications. And there's a lot of debate about whether or not open source is more secure because they have a whole community of people looking at it versus what you write by yourself. Or we hear all the time that people have to be very careful when they bring open source code into their applications because there may be vulnerabilities that exist or somehow conflict with the code that they have. So I'm just curious to know what your guys' take is on the state of security of open source software.
I don't, like anything, I mean, like the point I just made, it's a broad spectrum. There are some very well-funded open source projects which are, for all intents and purposes, commercial products. You just don't have to pay for them.
Right.
I'm thinking of things like Spring Framework, obviously very popular in the Java world. I think the thing that you have to bear in mind is that given that it's a broad spectrum, you could probably take your average application, which is 70, 80, 90% open source, and say some of that is really well managed, some of it less so. You almost have to, unfortunately, treat all open source at the same level as the less managed stuff to be cautious. But is it more or less secure than the code that you're writing yourself, your proprietary code? Probably not. I think the kind of recent statistics say it's about the same. you manage it in a slightly different way. I mean, as an attacker, you think about it in a slightly different way, right? As an attacker, if I'm trying to break into an application and I've got 90% of the app written as open source code, where I can usually find out what version of the library or framework has been used, and therefore I've got a list of all the vulnerabilities in it, that's where I'm going to go. You know, that's my focus. I'm not trying to find 0 days in the proprietary code, because that's just, it's difficult. Right? It's not as easy as just saying, right, click around a couple of times and boom, there we've gotten into the app. So the focus as an attacker is more on the open source side of things, which I think should be reflected in how organizations think about managing that open source code, rather than saying open source is a bigger threat because it is free. Effectively, it's just not quite true.
Okay, good. Juan, you have thoughts?
Yeah. So I mean, there, to kind of like mirror what Chris was saying here, it's true. There's certain open source libraries that are well funded and they have better security standards around those types of open source libraries. But then you have the ones that are just not well funded at all, but they're still heavily used, and those probably have holes, right? So it's actually, if you break it down based on languages, you're going to see that there's a slightly higher vulnerability density with like more of the open source leading stuff versus some of the more closed source .NET side of things, right? So you're going to be able to see that. And the way you treat it is you have to go ahead and make sure that the code, if you're scanning your own first party code, you should be scanning the third party libraries to some degree to make sure that you have a full scope of your true security for your application. Right. You also have with certain languages, that some more modern languages today, where they're abstracting out the complexities that can get you in trouble and get you some code weaknesses. And for some of those languages, you have actually, both for the language, low findings of code weaknesses, and also with those third-party libraries for those languages, you also have a lower vulnerability density around their open source libraries. In general, I would worry about everything the same way you worry about your first party code, and try to get some solution in there, whether it's open sourced, again, open source, scanning open source, or you go ahead and go through like a paid tool.
Right. Okay, so we have one more question, and that'll wrap this thing up. And it's about Veracode itself. And our attendee Lee would like to know how Veracode helps developers get hooked on security and what differentiates Veracode from competitors. So in just a couple of minutes, maybe you can shed some light on that.
Sure.
Sorry, go on, huh?
Go ahead.
For me, you know, if I think about sat in front of my machine writing code, there's been many times when, you know, not thinking about necessarily Veracode as such, I'm trying to get an environment set up where I can do some sort of testing, or you know, iterate on my code in some way, deploy it locally, that kind of thing, and it can take inordinate amounts of time to get those systems up and running and understand them in depth. You know, if I think about the kind of open source scanning engines, you can quite easily end up, you know, digging through source code there to try and figure out what's going on. And given that we're a SaaS platform, there is no on-premise component really to what we do. All of that kind of pain is taken away from you as a developer. So it's very much about giving you the ability to use those you know, in-depth, accurate scanning engines, but without having the pain of having to manage them yourselves. I think that's the kind of, you know, if I think about my day-to-day workflow as a developer, that's probably the big difference for me personally.
Yeah, I think so. I used to buy a lot of software before for another organization, and what I always found the most valuable was how intuitive is the tool to use to solve my exact problem that I'm buying it for, right? So I would typically have 2 or 3 different vendors lined up, and I would have to go through the process of trying to set them up and implement them, and how quickly can I go from, you know, purchased all the way to using the tool. And the nice thing is, if you were to line up a bunch of security tools and throw them in front of a developer and say, use these things, right? and it says how to use them, you're like, I don't know, you have to figure it out. The intuitiveness of Veracode is pretty good. The documentation is actually pretty good as well, and it kind of gets you starting really quickly. There's no need to like install things, no need to engage other departments to manage servers and get applications installed. So from that side, if you're a developer, you're in crunch time and you just need something scanned, our tools can pretty much do that for you, right? And the amount of support behind it all is there as well. We have specialists that know about your specific environments to assist you in implementing your tools, whether it's automated environments, whether it's just your environment on your laptop. They have that. They have the community behind it as well. There's a whole set of forums that people can go ask questions. So a lot of enablement is there. But again, if it's the 11th hour, you need to run a scan, Vericode's going to be able to do it pretty quickly. And I think at the end of the day, that's probably what most developers would want.
Right. Well, listen, guys, thank you so much for your time today. I thought this was a great conversation, and hopefully our attendees have enough takeaway to get their teams hooked on security, the developers. So again, Chris Campbell and Juan Mezo from Veracode, thanks so much for your time. I also would like to thank Veracode for sponsoring today's event, and of course, thank all of our attendees for being here today. So until next time, I'm Dave Rubenstein. So long for now.
Thank you.
Thank you.